Hello and welcome back to another episode of Solutions Pod, which is brought to you by naturehub.com, a platform that makes it easier for you to find healthy, eco-friendly businesses and product sourced locally in your area. I'm Jay Harvey Lewis, the co-founder of Nature Hub, and joining me today is our co-host Sia Vasovic and Neil Kitching, the author of recently published Carbon Choices, Common Sense Solutions to Our Climate and Nature Crises. Neil, I really appreciate your book's approach. There's a lot of activists and folks that are really using, I guess, what I consider fear tactics, which can sometimes have the unintended consequence of making people feel a bit hopeless and paralyzed. But you really take the time to troubleshoot a wide range of issues related to this topic and calmly empower people. So Neil, it's great to have you on, and I'd really like to know how you got on this journey. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to this.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a very long journey. Going back a long time, I studied geography at university. And at that time, I completed a couple of modules on climate change and on the ice sheets in Antarctica, and was well aware at the time that if we carried on emitting carbon dioxide at the same rate, we were heading for a catastrophic future. But came out of university, ended up becoming an accountant, and worked in business for many years, and just wondered why society, government, businesses were really ignoring this issue that I was always aware of. So midlife, I had a bit of a crisis, and after a bit of training and quite a lot of difficulty, I secured a career change into sustainable development policy work. And so I now work with Scottish Enterprise in a role advising businesses around energy and water management. So I learned a huge amount from that and had a background from geography and put the two and two together. So geography angle and business angle, and produced this book, Carbon Choices.
Yeah, and then specifically on the business side, we do obviously come across a lot of businesses that kind of create an illusion of changing their ways to more sustainable and carbon neutral, when in fact it's not really the case. So do you think a lot of businesses are actually greenwashing us, and how do they actually do it?
Yeah, of course, there's examples of greenwashing, but every business is different. So some are goodies and some are baddies, and some try to be good but are actually bad. So there's a full range. You can't really categorize business into one or the other. But companies are under pressure these days. So even BP has set a net zero target, but that's for 2050, and to me that's rather meaningless. We're really needing action in the next 10 to 20 years, not waiting out to 2050. And as I understand it, their net zero target excludes all the operations in Russia, so that's not very helpful either. And then the big supermarkets, they all claim to be going green and to be cutting plastic use, and yet globally the amount of single-use plastic is still increasing. So all these initiatives haven't yet achieved their aims. And then thinking about greenwashing, you get companies like EasyJet who now advertise in British newspapers saying, fly with us and we will offset your emissions, which gives the impression that you can fly with them and not damage the planet. I really don't believe that. In practice, what they're doing is they are offsetting. They do plant trees, and somebody will have calculated that the trees will absorb an equivalent amount of carbon from the flight. But there's no way we could scale that up. And there's also the risk that the trees might burn down in 20 or 30 years, so the carbon might not be a permanent removal. So the idea that you can offset your emissions at £1 to £2 per flight is just nonsense. It's a much more difficult problem than that to solve.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people aren't quite aware of the math behind the problem of carbon dioxide. I know I wasn't until I read your book. Do you mind just explaining a little bit about how what seems like a small amount of energy consumption, for example, like driving a semi truck across the United States, how that ends up producing a massive amount of carbon, even though you only put a small amount of gas in the tank?
Yeah, the mass, well, it's just scale, I guess. So there's nearly 8 billion people. And so if you're all driving a small amount and all emitting a bit of carbon, it adds up. So in the latest figures, as a world, we were emitting over 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per year. So that's a big number. 1 ton of carbon dioxide would perhaps fill a hot air balloon. So if you multiply that up by 40 billion, you can see that we are putting a significant amount of gases into the atmosphere. But I think the point to note is the climate is very sensitive. The climate's changed through natural processes in the past, and it's changed dramatically. So the last ice age was caused by very small changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun. Yeah, quite small changes, but these are amplified by the way nature can change and amplify, and there's various tipping points where one thing leads to another. So small changes could lead to average temperature changes of 5 degrees centigrade between the peak of an ice age and the end of an ice age. So if that can happen naturally, you can imagine what's happening if we then put 40 billion tons of a warming gas on top of that into the atmosphere. We really are heading for an unpleasant future.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the other, I guess, dangerous compounds that are going out into the atmosphere other than carbon, because I think there's a lot of focus on just carbon, but that's really not the full picture of things.
Yes, we often talk about greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is the main one. It's about 70% of the impact. The other two big ones are nitrous oxide and methane. And methane is predominantly produced by cattle and sheep, and it's actually them burping. That's the way they digest grass, and as a natural process, the methane is released. And then nitrous oxide, a lot of that comes from farming. So that comes from the decay of fertilizers in the soil, and also the management of manure. So these gases are significant too. And then there's a danger that if the permafrost in the Arctic areas starts melting, well, it already is starting to melt, then methane, which is currently trapped under the frozen soil, under the frozen surface, can be released into the atmosphere. And that could be another powerful gas. So that's one of these reinforcing, one of these tipping points that can, where one small change can actually lead to a bigger effect. So yeah, we need to think about, it's not just oil, gas, and coal. We need to think about our agricultural practices too.
Yeah, methane is definitely a powerful gas. That's why I stopped eating eggs a few years back. But it's also Russia. There's been some tremendous sinkholes that have just been popping out. I mean, just like massive amounts of gas under there. So yet, it is pretty interesting. I'm kind of curious. You mentioned in your book some of the victories that people have had over the years. So this isn't all just humans messing up the planet and not being able to solve any problems. And I'm kind of curious, you mentioned the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, and I guess how that sort of has really been an example of success.
Yes, I think if you want to be more optimistic about it, so we identified the hole in the ozone layer in the early 1990s, and this was caused by CFC gases, which were reacting particularly in very cold areas above the North and the South Pole. And there were also greenhouse gases, so there was a double impact of CFCs. Governments seem to realize the seriousness of this, and there was an international conference, the Montreal Protocol, which enacted a series of regulations and bans on CFCs. And very quickly, they were phased out. We used to have CFCs and deodorant propellants, and that was very quickly banned. These things haven't fully taken effect, but already we're seeing a reduction in the problem with the ozone layer. So that's a great example of success, but on the wider carbon dioxide, we don't have such an example of success. We're coming up to COP26 in Glasgow in November this year. So COP26 is the 26th International Climate Conference. First one was, I can't remember the exact date, but probably before 1990. And ever since 1990, carbon emissions have continued to rise, apart from a slight fall last year during COVID. So we've had 26 rounds of negotiations, and I don't think anybody can claim that's been successful.
So does this COP26, does it has it brought any positive results? Or because I know you have attended the last one, right? So what was discussed and how does it usually take place?
So I haven't actually attended myself, but the last big conference, because every 5 years they have a larger conference. The last large one was in Paris, and that was deemed by most commentators to be a success. It was the first time when a proper international agreement involving all countries was signed. And it's a voluntary agreement. Every country has to decide voluntarily how much they want to cut their emissions. And that's probably why it was agreed that there was nothing being imposed on anybody other than intergovernmental peer pressure. But has that been a success? Well, again, carbon emissions continue to rise following that conference. So that's not a measure of success in my eyes. So the COP26 this year in Glasgow, this is really the critical one. This is when governments get back together 5 years after Paris and agree on the rule book, how we're going to police, how we're going to monitor these emissions. We need to agree on climate finance, so how we help developing countries to meet their climate commitments. And there's all the kind of details that negotiators love to spend lots of time discussing. And they'll also be discussing carbon offsetting and whether countries can still emit carbon, but offset it in some other ways. So to me, the measure of success of the COP26 conference will be whether, not so much whether there's an agreement, but whether global carbon emissions start falling after that date.
I'm kind of curious how the average person, not the people up at the top, but just the average people who are trying to be conscious consumers, aside from avoiding some of these companies that are kind of clearly greenwashing us, what are some of the things that people can do in their everyday lives that can help to solve this issue?
Yeah, there's a lot individuals can do, although it was very hard, perhaps impossible for individuals to go green when the kind of regulations and society around about you doesn't really enable it. But saying that, yeah, there's a lot you can do. So I think the first thing really is to think about where you live and how you live. So do you live in a area where you can walk or cycle to shops, where your children can walk to school? Do you live in a house that suits your needs? It's not got spare bedrooms or spare bathrooms that nobody uses. Do you share your house with other people, or do you live alone or just as a couple? These are the questions that most of us don't really think about, but they are what have a big impact on how much carbon dioxide you will emit. So if you live in the countryside, it almost inevitably means that you need a car, perhaps 2 cars, and that you drive every day to access all the services that you need. So yeah, that's really the first thing to think about. Where do you want to live? Where do you choose to live? And then I think the next big thing is probably your diet. So around 25% of our emissions come from food and agriculture. So you need to think about what you're eating. Again, this is quite difficult because when you go into a supermarket, you're overwhelmed with choice, but it's all about brands and prices. It's not about the carbon and environmental impact of products. So I'd like to see these products with a carbon label on it to help consumers. And we need businesses and supermarkets to do that. But it's very clear looking at diets that it's really how much you eat, how much food you waste. So there's nothing worse than wasting food because of all the carbon, methane and nitrous oxide emissions that's caused. And then you need to think about your beef, your lamb, and all the dairy products, which unfortunately includes things like ice cream, cheese, and chocolate, which I love. But these have a disproportionate impact. So I'm not suggesting we all go vegan or vegetarian, but I do think we should be thinking about reducing the amount of those foods that we all eat.
Yeah, it would be nice to see some of the grazing animals put back in places like North America, where they once roamed and had a very symbiotic relationship with the nature, instead of cutting down rainforests in Brazil. So that's my main concern when I hear about the beef industry, and like we can't get those rainforests back and all the species there, and just thinking about all the possible cures for disease that are yet to be discovered, that are just maybe growing right under the canopy there. I appreciate you go through a lot more. So folks listening to this, Neil outlines solutions for businesses, for people, for different industries and government. So it's quite a detailed overview.
So you did obviously mention that we can personally change our diets and, in order to contribute to the solution. But is there anything that we as consumers can do to influence businesses towards more sustainable paths? Is there any advice you would give?
Well, obviously, every time you buy anything, you're indirectly influencing businesses. So the choices you make impact their performance, how much they sell. They will quickly take account of that. So I've recently changed to buying oat milk rather than full-fat dairy milk. The supermarket will notice that change. They'll then influence their suppliers. So there's a kind of chain reaction. So that's one obvious way of putting pressure on businesses. The other, of course, is active campaigning, which not many of us do, but perhaps more of us should. So we should be asking our politicians to have tighter but sensible regulations on business. By sensible regulations, I mean regulations that are flexible, that are kind of based on the output you want to achieve, but don't tell businesses exactly how to go about their business. So yeah, influencing politicians and writing to businesses, and obviously with social media these days, it can be far easier to launch a campaign or to complain to supermarkets and to businesses. So yeah, there's lots you can do, and I would encourage everybody to go out there and to do that. Particularly looking at international supply chains. So things like products like palm oil, which are nearly all grown in areas of tropical rainforests that have been chopped down just to produce palm oil. And then that oil is actually in, somebody said, up to 50% of foodstuffs and even cosmetics sold in supermarkets. So palm oil itself is a big driver of deforestation.
Yeah, that's definitely a big topic. And it kind of, palm oil kind of came up really suddenly. And I think there's a few organizations that are claiming to do sustainable palm oil. I'd like to actually talk to them personally about that and see if that's true or if that's a case of greenwashing. You mentioned oat milk. I would definitely strongly, as an American, advise you to look into the source of it, because a lot of American wheat is treated with heavy amounts of glyphosate, the Roundup, before harvest, and it can, that's an ecological as well as a health issue. Kind of curious what your thoughts are on some of the issues that aren't specifically related to carbon, but are like very serious environmental concerns that we need to also address as we're, I guess, trying to address one issue. We don't want to let 5 other ones pop up. So what are some of the other biggest concerns that you have in relation to protecting the environment and biodiversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's dozens and dozens of environmental issues, and climate change is just one, but it is a kind of overarching, rather overwhelming issue, which will then adversely impact on lots of other environmental issues. But in my book, I try and cover climate change and nature loss, because nature loss is so important. To some extent, climate change and nature are intertwined, particularly around trees and cutting down trees and the carbon emissions from that. So if you think about nature, what we've done is we've almost destroyed nature. That's quite a strong statement, but it's, if you look at the statistics, all nature statistics are down in the 80-90%. And we've forced nature into islands of protected areas, often called national parks. And that works reasonably well in the short term. But this is very difficult for genetic diversity to spread between these islands of nature reserves. Over the long term, it's not a great idea. But even worse, with climate change, our climatic zones are going to shift. So they're going to shift towards the poles. So that means that these protected islands of nature in 10, 20 years' time, relatively soon, are going to be in the wrong place. And that means that, the nature there, we're going to be struggling to preserve what we've already got. So that's a long, slow burn disaster in the making. We could try and solve that through some sort of corridors connecting up nature reserves, which might have some effect, but really climate change, long term is really catastrophic. And it's not just nature that's going to be in the wrong places. Humans, where we live, and our agriculture is all going to be in the wrong climatic zones too. If you look at a map of population density in the world, it's really affected by two things. One is mountains, and the other is climate. And so people live in places which have a good climate. But if these zones all shift 200 or 300 miles towards the poles, then our cities are all going to be in the wrong place. Our agriculture is going to be in the wrong place. And you can just imagine the political strife and the migration that that's going to cause in the decades ahead. Probably not a pretty picture.
And yeah, I suppose there are some of our listeners who might be a bit new to this topic. I know for sure that some of my friends are going to be watching it, and they're quite new to this. So if any of them are finding themselves overwhelmed, would you be able to kind of summarize the key message, the go home message from your book?
The key message is we've got ourselves into this mess, and as a society, we can get ourselves out of this mess, but only if we all work together. We need individuals, we need businesses, we need communities, we need governments to all be acting on this. And although there's lots of well-meaning people, I just don't see the scale of action required that's happening, but it could do. And as individuals, I think we should be doing what we can. It may seem like a small thing, but it can have a knock-on beneficial impact. So if you install solar panels on your house, or if you buy an electric vehicle, your neighbors come around and have a look, they show an interest, and then all studies show they're much more likely to go out and install solar panels and buy an electric vehicle. A small change then has a knock-on beneficial impact on other people. And I think that's a powerful message.
Neil, how can people find you online, and where can they buy your book?
Great question. So Carbon Choices is available on Amazon and on Kindle worldwide. And you can also have a look at my website, which is www.carbonchoices.uk. There's information there on my book and some blogs that I've written that might be of interest.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for this insightful conversation. We've definitely learned so much from your book, but also from your Twitter account, which has a lot of up-to-date information, and just simply by talking to you as well. So thank you for this, and thank you for spreading the word and just raising the awareness altogether. Yeah, and for our listeners, so if you still have any questions left, if you'd like to share your own experience or leave any comments, do that in the box below, and see you next time.